Welcome, Lunalander.
The glory days of the video game arcade might be a long way behind us sadly, but they certainly haven't been forgotten. In this video I'm going to take you back over 40 years to those heady days that played such an important part in our youth. The year is 1979 and there are some pretty revolutionary changes happening in the world of arcade games. Manufacturers are now building their games around CPUs rather than fixed circuits, which not only allows the games to be more advanced, but also greatly expands the creativity on offer too. But perhaps the biggest change we saw was the introduction of colour graphics, something that was soon taken for granted. Thanks to the hugely successful release of Space Invaders the year before, arcades had begun to move into the mainstream, appearing in such places as pubs, shops, cafes and all sorts of other sociable places too. This was the year that we started to see some coin-ops selling huge numbers, and new companies started to crop up all over the place in both Japan and North America, all hoping for the next big hit. Another interesting thing about 1979 was the rise of vector-based arcade games too, something that will become a mainstay of arcade halls for many years. The glowing displays gave these coin-ops a real point of difference from the new home systems that were also starting to gain in popularity around this time, such as the Atari 2600, Intellivision and Philips Videopack, aka the Magnavox Odyssey 2. Now set the scene, it's time to dive in and look at the very best arcade games that 1979 had to offer. Looking back at this game now, it's hard to believe that anyone found it enjoyable. It's in black and white, has just one player on each team, a simple single screen court, and none of the crazy dunks you'd associate with later video game adaptations of the sport like NBA Jam. But it was also incredibly fun against the second player, and saw equally popular ports to both Atari's 2600 VCS console and the 8-bit computer range too. It's also rather famous for being featured on the classic comedy movie Airplane, being played in the cockpit by none other than NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Whilst OSMO Wars wasn't the first arcade game created by the iconic SNK, it was the first one to be a success, and undoubtedly the game that put the company on the map. It was also the first one not to be a rip-off of somebody else's game, taking the form of a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up. One of the very earliest examples of the genre in fact. For this reason alone, OSMO Wars is an incredibly influential title in the history of arcade video games, even if it would soon be surpassed by many similar titles, most notably Nichibatsu's Mooncrester and Namco's Galaga. One of Nintendo's very earliest arcade games, Sheriff was actually designed by none other than Genyo Takeda and Shigeru Miyamoto. Released by Exidy as Bandido in the West, Sheriff was also one of the earliest Western-themed video games. The game picturing the spurred boots of the titular sheriff trying to defend his town against a group of bandits. The game was actually quite unpopular with arcade audiences, mainly due to the overcomplicated controls, so has now become very obscure, but there's certainly no doubting Sheriff's historical pedigree. One of the very first maze games to appear in arcades, making it a notable influence on Pac-Man, which would arrive the year after, Head-On was an almost instant success. This led to a huge number of clones and bootlegs being created by Sega's many rivals, most notably in the form of Atari's Dodgem for the 2600 VCS. In fact, it's highly likely that many of you out there won't even know this game from the arcades, and instead played one of the many home adaptations. Initially a single-player game, a two-player alternative arrived not long after. Whilst pinball tables have been around for a very long time and were a familiar sight in arcade halls everywhere, video game adaptations of them were not. In fact, Atari's Video Pinball was the very first attempt to replicate the bouncing bumpers and frantic flippers in pixel form when it originally arrived as a standalone console back in 1977, before its transition to arcades in 1979 and, a year later, the Atari 2600 console too, where it's perhaps best known. It might have lacked many of the bells and whistles associated with real pinball, but proved popular nonetheless. The groundbreaking games continue in the form of Vector Beam's long-forgotten Warrior. What makes this one incredibly notable is that it represents the very first one-on-one fighting game to appear in arcades, a genre that remains widely popular to this day. And that makes it even sadder that this ambitious vector-based coin-op has been lost in the sands of time. The top-down viewpoint might seem a little strange to those more familiar with the side-on looks of later games, but the great animation and interesting game mechanics still impress. The idea of this game was to launch a little man out of a plane and then glide into one of the many platforms below to earn a pre-designated score. A plane moves across the top of the screen with you choosing when to jump. A hero will initially skydive at great speed, but as soon as you pull the real ripcord on the innovative cabinet, it will slow down and you have much more accurate control over his movement. Stopping you landing on the platforms are helicopters that randomly fly around the screen trying to send you to a watery death. Ripcord is definitely one of Exidy's more underrated machines. One thing that really struck me about the games in this list is how influential many of them were at the time, before being quickly forgotten by arcade audiences. Another great example of this comes in the form of Taito's Lunar Rescue, a game that was widely cloned on the many home computers of the age, which is very much a testament to the game's success. One of the best things about Lunar Rescue is the way it combines elements from lots of other games of the time as you try to navigate through an asteroid field, land on the designated platforms, and transport the stranded humans back to the mothership. This one's still a real favourite of mine. It's easy to forget that before the hugely successful Super Monaco GP games came this title, with a full 10 years separating them in fact. Whilst a much later game used a now more familiar first-person perspective, the original Monaco GP took its cue from other popular racing games of the era, such as Atari Sprint Series and Atari 2600 Classic Street Racer, with a top-down viewpoint. But what it did have is all the thrills and spills associated with the high-octane world of F1 that we all know and love. Probably the most obscure game on this list, Sundance deserves its place due to the pure originality that it offers. Up until this point, vector-based arcade games have mostly taken the form of shoot-em-ups, and indeed will continue to do so. But with Sundance, Cinematronics really tried to do something different, introducing puzzle-like mechanics to a familiar arcade formula, so it's a real shame that Sundance failed to catch on. The idea is to create portals to trap the glowing stars as they bounce between two grids. This required quick reflexes, anticipation and almost perfect timing. The third game in the GB trilogy that started the year before with both GB and then Bombi, QTQ is undoubtedly the most important of the three, mainly because of the groundwork it's set at Namco rather than any individual success. The game was designed by Shigeru Yokoyama and Toru Iwatani, who many will know as the designer of Pac-Man, and in fact he stated in interviews that the use of identifiable characters in this game was a major influence on his most famous creation. A fun and quirky combination of Pinball and Breakout, the name was inspired by the famous song Suzy Q. While there are many arcade games in the early years that took inspiration from Star Wars, there's no doubt that Tail Gunner is one of the most obvious and influential. Straight away you will notice that this is a vector-based shoot-em-up that bears a pretty uncanny resemblance to Atari's official Star Wars game that would finally arrive 4 years later. Not just in looks but also the way it plays, as you use your guns and shields to stop the enemy fighters getting past you. There is also a sit-down version of the game available too that was rather confusingly retitled as Tail Gunner 2. Undoubtedly one of the most iconic, innovative and influential games released in this year, Lunalander was a huge success for Atari and the originator of the whole inertia-based genre that would be further popularised by games like Thrust, OIDS, and indeed Atari's own Gravitar. The glowing vectors set the scene for this game perfectly, as you tried to land your craft on the moon's surface below, battling gravity, inertia, and a limited amount of fuel to power your thrusters. There are few games from this era that were cloned and copied as much as Lunalander was on home systems of the time. Sega's Deep Scan is probably the earliest example you'll find of a remake or remaster, because almost the exact same game was released just 2 years before as Depth Charge. The original title suffered somewhat from its slow speed and simple black and white visuals, so Sega chose to have another go at the concept by adding a fast microprocessor, colour graphics and some slightly tweaked gameplay. It proved successful once again, and the coin-op also reached a new audience in the 90s as it was included as a hidden game in the superb Sega Saturn port of Die Hard Arcade. Originally created by the University of Tokyo's theoretical science group, Hyanko Alien was later picked up for distribution by arcade giants Nichibatsu. While it might not look like much at first, there's actually some pretty innovative gameplay here that went on to influence many other more successful games. Amongst these mechanics is the maze-based monster dodging concept that is somewhat reminiscent of Pac-Man, and the way you dig holes to trap the enemies, an idea that was later copied by titles like Space Panic and Lode Runner. It's just a shame it wasn't better known in the West. In a year when we saw many legendary arcade companies make their name, Astro Fighter was the title that launched Data East into the mainstream. Although it was nothing more than a take on the already popular Space Invader formula, Astro Fighter added some pretty unique features of its own, such as scrolling, colour graphics, randomised attack patterns, defined level structure, and the need to refuel your ship. This huge success of the game in Japan saw it picked up for distribution in the West by Sega. It also went on to spawn several sequels, including Super Astro Fighter and Astro Blaster. The second such game on this list, baseball, followed on from football, soccer and basketball to complete the Atari Sports series of arcade games. Upon release, Atari boasted that it offered the most realistic video baseball attraction ever created. Like the hugely successful Atari Football from the year before, it only came in a cocktail table variety and also utilised trackball controls. A 1 or 2 player game, it also offered up 4 different hitting plays, 4 different pitches and the ability to add coins for extra innings. Atari Baseball was another huge success for the Sunnyvale based company. Before they hit the big time with titles like Space Panic, Ladybug and Mr. Do, Universal created the highly underrated Cosmic Gorilla. It might initially seem like just another Space Invaders rip-off, but looks very much deceiving in this case, as the rather original gameplay so you're trying to protect a base from incoming aliens who want to abduct all the troops. You also needed to watch out for the bonus ships that swept across the screen from time to time. Universal boasted that the stunning cabinet art was designed by legendary manga illustrator Shotaro Ishimori, a real coup for the time. What is there left to say about Namco's iconic Galaxian? It took the winning formula of Taito Space Invaders and turned it up to 11, with a host of huge improvements. We now had aliens that attacked individually, a scrolling starfield, and bonus points being awarded for bravery. Galaxian was also the first video game to feature RGB colour graphics, and the first to use a tile-based display system too. The huge success of Galaxian saw it spawn numerous sequels, including the ever-popular Galaga. Yet somehow it still wasn't the biggest game released in 1979, as we're about to find out. When talking about the greatest arcade games of 1979, there are none greater than Atari's Asteroids. Designed by Lyle Rains, Ed Logg and Dominic Walsh, the vector-based space shooter would go on to become one of the most successful arcade games of all time, spawning numerous sequels, almost endless clones, and influenced countless other games. It was also one of the very first arcade titles, along with the likes of Space Invaders and Pac-Man, to become part of mainstream pop culture. It's almost impossible to explain just how important asteroids was in a video such as this. And that rounds up my look at the greatest arcade games of 1979. Are there any you can think of that should have made this list? Or do you disagree with any of the entries that I did include? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, James Taylor, Neptune, Chaotic, Seth Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Tiago Piero dos Santos Silva and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to a host of extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.